Okay, hello everyone. I'm Jason Cowley, editor of the New Statesman, for a few more days. I stepped down at the end of the year after 16 years in the chair. I'm going to introduce my excellent panel in a moment. Our discussion today is left conservatism, the future. But I thought I might just wonder what of the past. What are the origins of left conservatism, the concept, the phrase? It's something we've thought a lot about at the New Statesman, as there's a group of us on the New Statesman that's been very critical of the excesses of what John Gray calls ultra-liberal progressivism. We have liberals on the staff. It's a plural, open, tolerant magazine. But I think above all other publications in the United Kingdom, we've interrogated what liberalism is over the last 10 to 15 years. Morris spoke yesterday of the traditions of the influence of nonconformism, of Catholicism on the Labour Party. Dan Hitchens and I were talking about it yesterday, and we thought about Ruskin, the kind of romantic conservatism of Ruskin and the veneration of the worker. We thought too about guild socialism. But there are two quotes I'd like to use, and then I'm going to introduce the panel. One, of course, is George Orwell, and I think one of the defining texts of left conservatism is The Lion and the Unicorn, his great book written in 1940 as the bombs were falling on London. Orwell conflicted about his Englishness, about his class identity. He only found in England that he could respect deep underground in the Wigan mines. He went to Wigan to criticise or attack the excesses of capitalism and came back to London for the second half of the book and attacked the left, what we today might recognise as the kind of ultra-progressive Guardian left. But the book was an attack on book-trained socialism, progressivism, and there's a lovely little line by Orwell's wife, Eileen, that when he was working on The Lion and the Unicorn, the bombs coming down on London, it was published in 1941, she wrote, "George has written a little book explaining how to be a socialist, though Tory." So let's hold that thought, how to be a socialist, though Tory. Surprisingly, the other person I'm going to cite and a comment is Norman Mailer, who one wouldn't recognise necessarily as a conservative, a libertine, a narcissistic individualist, boorish, an anti-feminist. But in the late 60s, early 70s, he defined himself as a left conservative. I was wondering if that's the first popular usage of that term. Dan Hitchens and I think it probably is. He was married 6 times. He stabbed one of his wives. We wouldn't recognise him as a conservative. But what he said, and I think this resonated. Of his 6th wife, he said, "She's half my age and twice my height." And yet, he said something I think quite profound about left conservatism. In an interview with Martin Amis, the novelist, he said, "Liberalism worries me. It strikes me as a cover for people who are essentially totalitarian. They want it their way. I become uneasy when I find people drawing up solutions, which is, of course, the great vice of the left. Left conservatism," Mailer said to Amis, "is my way of reminding myself that you have to deal with everything in context. A solution that works in one place doesn't necessarily work in another," the theme of universal liberalism that we've been critiquing at this conference. Anyway, that's enough from me. I'm going to introduce what is a really excellent panel, I think, today, and they're going to speak in alphabetical order, so I'll introduce them in alphabetical order. We have today Phillip Blond, the original Red Tory, wrote a very famous essay, I think, published by David Goodhart in Prospect, The Rise of the Red Tories, I think, 2008, 2009? And then we profiled Phillip soon afterwards in the New Statesman, director of ResPublica, author of The Red Tory, and professor of Christian politics and philosophy at UPS University, Budapest. We have Miriam Cates. I'm delighted to have Miriam with us today, a Conservative MP most recently, GB News presenter, senior fellow of the Centre for Social Justice. So wonderful to have Miriam with us. Have my old editor, David Goodhart, who published my early essays in the mid-90s. David was founding editor of Prospect, editor for 15 years. Word perfect, I thought, when I delivered them. But David occasionally sent back an email saying, I think it may need a little trim. I can imagine that's a euphemism for something I didn't like. I had my revenge more recently when he wrote something for me at the New Statesman. I said, David, interesting piece. It may need a little trim. Anyway, he's now head of Demography, Immigration and Integration, Policy Exchange, and author most recently of The Care Dilemma. We have Dan Hitchens, who Dan and I were talking about left conservatism yesterday, and he came up with Mailer. You may have other names. Dan is a senior editor of First Things and a very thoughtful commentator and essayist. And I'm delighted to say we also have Katja with us, visiting research fellow at King's College London and author of Beyond the Wall. So I'm going to ask each of my panellists to speak for 6 to 8 minutes, no more, because I've got to get to London. So I promised my son, who's 15 in the middle of his GCSE mocks, that I'll take him to the Arsenal game at 3 o'clock. So I've got a tight schedule, but if I leave, David Goodhart is going to seamlessly take over his chair. Which I'm sure you'll be delighted about. So 6 to 8 minutes, and then we'll have a conversation or invite questions from the audience. So can we begin with the Red Tory himself, Phillip Blond?
I was in 2 minds whether to stand up or sit down,
No,
so
stand up.
I obey. Can there be a left conservatism? The answer is, of course there can, if we understand the left in conventional terms. As you will all know, because you're all intelligent students of history, such designation derives from the French Revolution, and the division from the French Revolution between left and right is primarily an economic one. So if we're asking, can there be a left conservatism, we are asking, can there be a conservatism that cares for those who lose out, that cares for those who are dramatically unequal? Can there be a conservatism that cares for the poor, the excluded, the lower deciles, the proletarians, the plebs? Well, of course there can. And there has been from Caesar onwards, who you might argue might well have been the first Red Tory. About that, more anon. But if that is just an economic answer, I mean, you go in England from Bolingbroke to Disraeli, up to Noel Skelton, up to, in certain dimensions, Anthony Eden. So a conservatism that cares for the poor, yes, of course, and most obviously. And I think if Red Tory has any merits from its publication in 2009, it lies in its prophetic quality, dare I say, where I said the future for the right was alliance with the needs of the working class across the world, and that the working class will move right because the left no longer serves the interests of the working class across the West. The left serves the interests of the cosmopolitan class, the winners, to quote David's magnificent book, the anywheres, and the left looks with derision and contempt upon those it purports to represent. So that's so much conventional, so much true. But I think let me answer this in a more interesting way. So why am I not a Marxist, even though I think Marx is a very profound thinker? Is primarily, I don't think economic division is the primary division in the organisation of human life. I never have. And I think the primary orientation in human life is ideation. Now, by ideation, I mean how people think the universal. I go with Eric Voegelin and his idea that all humanity thinks the universal, thinks about their place in relationship to the universal, and theorizes their social condition, their social organization, their ought, if you will, out of the formation of the universal. If you look at human painting, and it used to be the case that we didn't think Neanderthals painted until a recent discovery in France, when actually it appears they did paint, and they painted rather marvelously. And Roland Barthes wrote some interesting stuff on cave painting. But in cave painting, you can see as soon as you have the earliest humans, they think about the cosmos. They think about the cosmos and their place within it. If you think of contemporary painting, which is another great passion of mine, think of Aboriginal painting. Aboriginal painting paints the cosmos. That's why Aboriginal painting is the most advanced painting we have, because it paints the whole. To go back to Vogelin, every human society theorizes the universal first and foremost. It's not economic. It's ideation. It's how they think the universal. Now, if everything begins in ideation, and here I disagree with, as far as I can tell, almost everybody, but I think I'm right. If everything begins in ideation, then the really interesting question is about left conservatism. What sort of ideation do conservatives have? What is the differential relationship around ideation for conservatives as opposed to anyone else? Now, many of my friends are on the left, and I've never really felt affinity with the left, though I feel a great affinity with my friends. And I feel like a sort of a strange sort of primordial affinity with social conservatism and I call it social conservation, because social conservatism sounds like you hate people, which is odd, because what I want to do is preserve people. And I think, and I actually argued this in Red Tory, is I think if ideation is first, then social conservation for conservatives is first. So what do conservatives want to preserve most of all? The existing order. And this covers bad conservatism as well as good conservatism, let's be clear. But that is the primordial orientation of a conservative, is to see the value in what already exists. And this might be my only affinity with the Green movement, in the sense I see the value in the world as it is and I want to preserve it. And because we never see brute objects as brute objects, because every object tells you how you should view it, it's my third book, which remains largely unwritten, on how aesthetics teaches you how you should see, because I think all objects contain a relationship that tells you how you should see them, which is the role of painting, but leave that aside. Now, what this means then is ideationally, social conservatism is for me first. And I think anyone who is left-wing has to be a social conservative first. Because if you actually look at the sense of what is violated by inequality, it's the sense of the preservation of that order. The preservation of that order is always threatened by radical inequality. That's what gives rise to revolutions. That's what gives rise to human carnage. The recovery of this value set and the broadening of this value set is, for me, what constitutes politics. Now, within this order, I've written quite a lot about the value of empire. It's not that I don't believe in nation states, I do, but I think they're subsidiary to and derived from empire. Empire is first, empire has always been first, and nation states are adumbrations or responses to or excretions of empire, if I can call it like that. Now, to go back to the order, and to go back to the question I asked John, we are, in my view, in a contest of universals as human beings, and we always have been. And the contest is between the little cosmology you form as a tribal group and the extension of that cosmology when it meets other tribal groups and attempts to form a universal that includes them also. So a left conservatism, in my view, would be not just a conservatism that seeks to tackle inequality as an end in itself, but tackle inequality because it sees in other people images of the universal that it also upholds. And in seeing in other people who might have different skin colour from you, different codes than you, images of the universal that you uphold, conservatism becomes an expanding civilizational project that is necessarily imperial. What do I mean by that? It has no limit. What do I mean by that? That's why I ally myself, historically speaking, with the campaign of the British Empire against world slavery, which, by the way, only happened when Christians took control of the state and wrestled it away from Whigs, and then used precisely that value system to engage in mass contest across the oceans against the slave trade, which liberal capitalism had set up. So left conservatism then means for me a concern for the other human being, and properly ordered, and I've written also against nationalism. I think nationalism is unchristian and unconservative because it reduces that universal to typologies of race or place that always and necessarily lead to forms of racial conflict that one should abjure. But and if we don't conserve this imperial dimension, this sense that other humans can share our values, which all the great empires have always done, we are restricted of necessity to a type of partisan war against others who differ from us by the particulars that we choose to essentialize against that vision. So, left conservatism requires social conservatism because social conservation and ideation comes first. And if you want to tackle economic inequality, be a conservative because that's your precondition for doing so. Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you, Phillip. Miriam, please.
Thank you. Thank you. So I want to start really from Philip's phrase, what do Conservatives want to preserve? The existing order, and I would completely agree with that. But my argument now is that we've moved so far away from what those of us who are Conservatives would consider to be a conservative society, that actually we cannot get back to any sort of conservative order or indeed settled post-liberal order without the action of the state. And the action of the state, the idea of an active state that intervenes in some areas of our lives, that regulates, that taxes, that spends. Some Conservatives are allergic to that concept, people who would call themselves right-wing Conservatives. So my argument there is that if, as Conservatives, we want to return to a conservative society, we have to accept an active role of the state. And I believe that makes me a left Conservative in some circles, although in many circles I'm called far right. So make of that what you will. So being a scientist and not a philosopher, in fact, I studied natural sciences here over 20 years ago, and I don't think I've actually been back. I'm going to make a very, very practical speech, and I'm going to pick 3 serious problems that our society, and in fact most Western societies, face that I don't believe we can overcome without the power of state, but should be of utmost importance to Conservatives that Conservatives should care deeply about. The first of those problems is the crisis in child development. Now, some of you may have watched Keir Starmer's speech last week setting out 6 milestones, 6 targets that he wants his government to achieve by the end of the 5 years. And one of those targets really stuck out because it wasn't the standard economic, fair, welfare state that we've come to expect from politicians. It was something entirely different. But he's got a point, because around 1/3 of children now arrive at school age 4 and a half not being able to do the basic, essential things that they need to do to be able to learn. We're talking the basic virtues of self-control, of being able to behave, of being able to follow simple instructions like sit down, get up, put your coat on. 1/4 of children who started school this year were not toilet trained. 1/4 of 4-year-olds. Now, if your parents have not taught you the basic virtue or discipline of using the toilet by the age of 4 and a half, what are the chances that you are ever going to learn the virtues and the skills and the disciplines that you need for all of your life? We have a serious, serious crisis in child development. What's really interesting is that it's got much worse over the last 10 years. So yes, there are factors like family breakdown, for example, cost of living crisis that surely play into that. But what we hadn't anticipated is the rise of what I call screen-age parenting. So the use of an iPhone or an iPad to babysit a child. Now, I very fortunately had my children before smartphones were widely available. Otherwise, I feel sure that I would have also fell prey to this same temptation. But it's common now, isn't it, to see babies and even toddlers staring at tiny screens in public places. I saw it in a walk around the Peak District a few weeks ago. A little girl, probably 9 months old, in a buggy that had a special attachment to hold the iPhone 4 inches from her face. But this is normal. This is normal. What is it doing to our children's brains? It's hooking them on the dopamine hit of doom scrolling. It's preventing them from concentrating. It's preventing them from developing any form of impulse control. And this is going to be a disaster for society, not just for those individual children, but for our whole economy. If a third, a quarter of our children leave school unable to have the basic virtues, self-control, discipline, concentration they need to be active participants in society. And I'm pretty sure that the 40% rise in young men who are now not in education or training just since the pandemic has at least something to do with things like gaming addiction and the impact of social media on the brain. Now, there is no way this problem is going to resolve itself without some sort of intervention from the state. We are going to need a nanny state to explain to parents that you can't, that we are destroying children's brains, to regulate technology, all those kind of things. But Conservatives must care deeply about this problem. We are destroying so many of our children's brains. They're not even allowed to watch adverts for McDonald's now, but they are absolutely allowed to present themselves in front of the internet all times. The second problem that we have as a conservative society is the problem of internet pornography. And we're not talking about top-shelf magazines, we're talking about violent abuse of women. A third of the internet is pornography. Famously, Pornhub sets itself up as an entertainment site. Actually, it's a crime scene. There are many, many hundreds of thousands of videos of real rapes, real abuse of women and children, and it's created this international network of trafficking. And yet the average age to view this appalling material is 12. And the most likely place for a 12-year-old to find this material is on Twitter. And our young boys particularly are having their brains warped by this material, and it's now normal. Half of boys think that girls expect violence during sex. And there was a report in the Times a couple of years ago about a rape that took place in a school, and the teacher said to the 14-year-old boy, "Why didn't you stop when she started crying?" And he said, "Because I thought that was normal. That's what girls expect during sex." If we don't stop our children being warped and corrupted by online pornography, there is no chance of a good relationship between the sexes in the future, and that is what society depends on. And it's no surprise to me that more and more young people are single, that fewer and fewer people are getting married, that there's a huge rise in sexual abuse. Look at that appalling case in France that we've seen over the last few weeks of a woman who was drugged and raped by her husband and 70 other men. There's all this discussion about how men are bad and how men are dark. But pornography was the cause. They met on a pornography website. They were encouraged by a kind of pornography that encouraged them to do this. They filmed themselves doing it. They wanted to appear in a porn movie. Pornography is a destructive impact on our society. And unless we understand that, all the problems we now think of as terrible are going to get worse. The state has to get involved. We have to see pornography as a product in the way that we see tobacco or alcohol. We don't expect ordinary individual families to be able to protect their children from alcohol and tobacco alone. We do need regulation. And we can't get back to some sort of conservative understanding of sexual relationships without the involvement of the state to regulate or perhaps even ban some of the things that are on online pornography. And there's loads of different ways we could do that. My third problem that Imogen has already alluded to is the problem of declining fertility rates. And all the fantastic ideas that we've heard in this lecture theatre over the last 24 hours, very exciting ideas, none of them really are going to come into pass unless we work out how we're going to reproduce society as we have it today. And I'm not going to go into the long, complicated explanation of the different fertility levels and what that means for how many people we're going to have in the future. But needless to say, we are in a bad place. And unless we work out how to increase our fertility rates, we are going to be in trouble. Now, there are no answers to this. There are countries like Hungary that have tried some things, South Korea. I mean, they're basically finished, but they're still trying some things. 100 South Koreans today, between them, will have 15 grandchildren. That is population collapse. We're not quite in that position, but it's still pretty dire. And if we want to turn it around, the state is going to take an active role. Now, that's not the only answer. I think there are some deep cultural issues about why we're not pro-natal, but at the very least, the state is going to have to subsidise housing, incentivise marriage and childbearing, more generous maternity leave, all these kind of things. We are not going to solve that problem without an active state. So, in conclusion, yes, I hope the future is conservative. Any type of conservative I would settle for right now. But we have to accept as conservatives that given that we no longer do live in a conservative society, the only power really left to us to influence society going forward is the state. It is going to have to step in to solve these three and many other serious problems that our society faces. So I'm very, very happy in that context to be called left-wing.
Good. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. It's good to be among so many post-liberal friends today, and thank you to Vidal Romero for swapping with me. I'm meant to be in a later session, but very happy to be in this one. I think it's a fascinating subject, and I think left conservatism has been what one might call the kind of missing majority in the past generation, at least in Western politics. Why have none of the main political parties adopted it? Why has it been left to populists to express it, often in crude and sometimes ugly forms? Well, it's because I think the left parties went off in a very culturally left, hyper-left even, direction in the 60s and the 70s and never really returned, individualistic, anti-authoritarian, anti-tradition. That was cemented partly through the expansion of higher education. All of the centre-left parties in Europe, anyway, became essentially liberal graduate parties in the 80s and the 90s, cementing that kind of hyper-liberalism. What about the right parties? I mean, the right parties, in a way, ought to be more fertile ground for left conservatism, partly because I can't remember whose phrase it was. It might have been mine. Matthew Goodwin claims it too, but that it's easier for parties of the right to move left on economics than it is for parties of the left. Hang on, have I got that right? For parties of the right to move left on economics than it is for parties of the left.
Right on culture.
Exactly. Yeah. Thanks. But what the parties of the right obviously did do, particularly in America and Britain in the 1980s, was move very much in a free market direction, although obviously subsequently they've kind of moved back to a more kind of mixed economy focus. But anyway, we have there the great double liberalisation that we all rail against, the liberalisation of economies and the liberalisation of individual behaviour are part of the same broad move away from a sociocentric to a more individual-centric society. In economics, the trend weakened the state and strengthened market actors. In social norms, it weakened tradition and authority and empowered individual rights and desires. The political right is associated with the first, political left with the second. Now, much of that obviously represents a kind of emancipation, but left conservatism, I would say, should have emerged to balance the double liberalism and deal with its overshoots, its considerable overshoots, such as over-rapid deindustrialization in this country, excessive immigration, over-expansion of higher education, the antinomian politics of trans radicals. I'm glad to have got in antinomian. Well, it didn't emerge, partly thanks to the insight, and this I think actually belongs to Geoffrey Wheatcroft, the insight that back in the 1980s, the right won the economic argument and the left won the cultural argument. And that sort of remains still true today, even though governments of the right have not stopped the relentless expansion of the state and public debt and so on, partly because of the financial crisis, COVID, Ukraine, and so on. And a brief shout out to 2019 and the Gove, what one might call the Gove Cummings moment, when a Brexitized Tory party committed to levelling up could perhaps have embraced a kind of left conservatism, but that got buried under COVID and Boris shenanigans. So what are the future of left conservatism? I mean, I think its main rival is the sort of centrist liberalism of the uniparty, or in my lingo, of the anywhere hegemony. Basically, highly educated anywheres who tend to favour mobility, openness, comfortable with change, They represent about 20-25% of society, and a kind of merger of the cognitive meritocracy that's emerged in the last 40 or 50 years. A merger of the cognitive meritocracy and established elites is sort of what's happened. And they've ended up governing mainly in their own interests, expanded higher education, neglected vocational education, indifferent to industry, promoted professional and financial services. They like soft borders. They're happy to sacrifice national sovereignty for economic growth and so on. They've created a society designed for the highly educated and the cognitively able. And that leaves far too many people of average ability or non-academic ability feeling like second-class citizens. And I think this is left conservatism's historic opportunity. It has a better answer than the alternatives to the central question of modern politics, in rich democracies anyway, which is this: how to raise the morale and provide a sense of purpose for people, for the average person, without undermining the hierarchy of the highly intelligent and able that we require to keep the show on the road. Now, there are lots of policies one could think of to push us in this direction, making skilled apprenticeships as desirable as degrees, perhaps convert a third of our universities into technical colleges, restrict immigration, defend the citizen, non-citizen boundary more effectively, use Brexit freedoms creatively, reindustrialise where it's feasible. But the big one that we don't talk about enough, Miriam just touched on it a bit, is the family part of faith, flag, family. Families in the UK are in an absolute mess. We're European outliers in family instability. Nearly half of children in the UK are not living with both of their biological parents by the age of 14. About 25% of families with dependent children are single-parent families, and this is hugely, families are hugely more unstable in the bottom half of the income spectrum. I think it was very disappointing. I listened to Dan Carden yesterday. I don't know whether he's still here. He was talking about Liverpool Walton and the poverty of life in among his constituents. He did not mention the destruction of the family. I suspect about 40 or 50% of families in Liverpool Walton are single-parent families. Single-parent families are hugely overrepresented in the poverty statistics, and the family instability lies behind almost all of our social ills. People in the criminal justice system overwhelmingly come from unstable family backgrounds. The housing crisis, poor educational outcomes, poverty and inequality. The family is massive in all these things. Now, changing this is incredibly hard, which is perhaps why the political class, represented by Dan Carden's silence on this issue, there is a belief that somehow family is beyond politics and policy. We can't do anything about it, just a sort of given. Well, I would contest that. It's very, very hard to do things about it, but we're not trying in this country particularly. Family policy is essentially making it easier for both parents to spend more time at work. It's essentially about childcare. We're European outliers in not recognising the family in the tax system. Why not make it easier for one parent to stay at home when children preschool? It's very popular, it would reduce stress, it would make it much more likely that more families would survive those early stressful years when you're trying to combine bringing up small children with work pressures too. What did I say? Okay, all right. Final word. Just a practical suggestion. At the moment, we're spending nearly £9 billion a year on childcare subsidies. Why not give that money directly to young families? They could then choose whether to spend it on themselves, so they wouldn't have to. One of the parents wouldn't have to go out to work, or on nurseries, or on granny, or whatever. Parenting is very hard. Most people, though, can be a decent parent in the way that most people cannot be a decent surgeon or corporate lawyer. And just final advertisement, I've just written a book called The Care Dilemma. Jason mentioned it at the beginning, Caring Enough in the Age of Sex Equality. It's about the undervaluing of the family and the domestic sphere. Anyway, I recommend it to you as a manifesto of left conservatism. Thank you.
Well, in my allotted 6 to 8 minutes, I'd like to talk about three things. The Battle of the Somme, a box of vegetables, and the Labour government. And in so doing, to say something about the past, present, and future of left conservatism. So, in 1916, at the Somme, one of the most brilliant historians of his generation found himself trying and failing to hit a particular German soldier, and he kept missing him. He wasn't a bad shot, he just couldn't hit him, and it really annoyed him. He didn't have any hatred in his heart, he said, but he just hated the missing. When he reflected on this later, that soldier, the great historian and socialist R.H. Tawney, said that this was part of the madness of war. He wasn't relating to this other person as a human being to be loved and cherished, but as someone in a kind of game. And he said the same dehumanizing thing could be said about the economic system he was living under. In the same way, it promoted using the other rather than loving them, exploiting them rather than living in fellowship with them. Tawney's works were a great treasury of left conservative thought. And there's one paragraph in particular which I'm going to read out to you because it's extraordinary prose, and I think the greatest paragraph-long statement I know, with no disrespect to anyone in this hall, of left conservatism. So this is R.H. Tawney, always called himself a socialist. Here we go. All decent people are at heart conservatives, in the sense of desiring to conserve the human associations, loyalties, affections, pious bonds between man and man, which express a man's personality and become at once a sheltering nest for his spirit and a kind of watchtower from which he may see visions of a more spacious and bountiful land. All decent people are against a creed which tries such things by the standard of utility, as though there were any end of life except life itself. What makes the working classes revolutionary is that modern economic conditions are constantly passing a steamroller over these immaterial graces and pieties, breaking up homes, the family, casting venerable men onto the scrap heap because they are no good, using up children for their immediate commercial utility, and all in the name of material progress, that cotton may be cheap. They want the state to step in and put down these lawless vandals who judge human affections by their effect on the money market. They want to conserve the home, the property, the family of the worker. Well, I can't really improve on Tawney's poetry. My own prosaic translation would be, if a conservative is someone who's found something that's beautiful and wants to cherish it and protect it, a left conservative is someone who sees part of what it needs to be protected from is a rapacious liberal capitalism which knows the price of everything and the value of nothing, and which will commodify even the best things in our common life. And I don't think this is just a matter of fine words or high politics. It can happen now, which brings me to the box of vegetables. In this century, more affluent homes have liked having delivered to their door every week. Maybe some people in this room have this. A box of organic, farm-grown vegetables and some recipe suggestions for their week's cooking. Two companies in particular have done very well out of this, Abel & Cole and Riverford. 2007, Abel & Cole were bought up by private equity. And the founder of Riverford, Guy Watson Singh, was very affected by this. And he said that having built up his company, he would no more want it to be translated into something, it's hissing, to be turned into short-term shareholder value than he would sell one of his own children into prostitution. So he had to think about what to do with his company. And what he did was he set up a trust and put his 74% ownership share into that. He didn't take the, 40 million quid he could have done from selling it off, but put that trust in the name of the employees. So the employees, in effect, own the company. And when they work for it and do their bit, at work, they are part of something which they also own and which they have a real stake in, rather than working for distant shareholders who want to see a number going up. That is a left conservative thing to do. He recognized something beautiful this company built, and he found a way to defend it from the market forces which, in his view, would have emptied it out. So left conservatism is something everybody can practice in their own sphere, in their own life. You can practice it by leaving a work event early to take your son to a football match. You can practice it by turning away from the screen to talk to a real person, read a real book, or cook a real vegetable. But of course, we don't just want it at the micro level. We want this to be expressed in politics, and we want the state to be able to help people live out left conservatism. And I think, in a way, the Labour government at some level gets this. There is in the rhetoric of Labour a sense that they want to preserve the integrity of the nation. That's something beautiful. They want to preserve the dignity of work, about which Keir Starmer has spoken very movingly and quoted that great Auden poem in his conference speech, and something he has an understanding of. And they've tried to put this into effect in their policies. State intervention in exploitative housing markets, boosting workers' rights, collective bargaining, even if it's just in the care sector at the moment, an entrepreneurial state which won't just let the market rip, but which will try and support certain forms of industry. These are all authentic forms of the left conservatism, which I think should resonate with a lot of people in this room and resonate with the people of the country. And they've tried it, and it's been a fiasco. And they've had, the most steeply falling approval ratings of any government I can think of. Obviously, in my, living memory. Obviously, there are many causes for that, and it's very fun to, mock and critique the Labour government, and there is something very dreary about it, grey Labour, as the writer Alex Niven calls it. But I think for any left conservative, it should be really sobering to see a government just try and do that little bit of left conservatism and run into such big structural problems. So my view is the tradition of left conservatism is extremely rich. The intellectual resources are extraordinary. What left conservatives need to do is to look at the stubborn realities under our nose and see how they can be confronted, because without that, I don't know if left conservatism really has a future on the political scale. Thank you.
So I was a bit conscious after the earlier panel, which was very much steeped in Christianity, that you're now having to put up with an East German-born heathen for the next 10 minutes. And that's why you're probably not going to get a very kind of strong emotional case from me, but rather a sort of analysis as to what's happening with left-wing conservatism at the moment. And I'm going to use Germany as an example, since as a German-born historian of Germany, that's all I know. But I think it's also quite a revealing example because of the shall we say, ideological flexibility that Germany has shown so far over the last century. It's always a sort of quite an intense field of ideological experimentation. So I think if there is room for sort of new or merging political developments, that's always a landscape that responds quite strongly to those trends. So I think conservative or left-wing conservatism should work in Germany. It should not just be the future, but it should be the present. And as David has just said, basically, there is a majority for this. It is already the norm, I think, amongst the majority of the population. So when you look at sort of classic, sort of more right-wing or conservative sort of elements of the political spectrum, such as, say, immigration as a marker, you can see that there's a vast majority in Germany, certainly in German society, for a more restrictive policy on immigration. So just some figures from sort of recent studies there. In the summer, just before the state so regional elections happened in Eastern Germany, a survey was done on specifically asylum policy, and in that 77% of the participants said that they want a more restrictive
system, not just more restrictive. They said they want an Asylwende, a U-turn on asylum policy. So a complete reverse of what Germany has been doing sort of in recent years, 77%, so that's 3/4 of the population. And yet, apart from the right-wing AfD party, you don't see that reflected in the political spectrum at the moment, that sort of sentiment. Even now, where there's a snap election scheduled for February, it doesn't really feature as a big political sort of issue as part of the debate at the moment between the mainstream parties. It's sometimes sort of a side issue to sort of bigger ideas about society, but it isn't essential as it clearly is to the populace, to politicians. Similarly, if you look at other concerns that also rank very highly on people's list of things when they're asked, you get things like very high inflation, the cost of living, for young people housing, interestingly enough, even in Germany where you get a sort of very rental-orientated housing market, even there young people basically say that housing is one of their main concerns. Overall, you find that the youngest generation now that is just coming through are actually a lot more socially conservative than older people are. So when they're asked about their dreams and aspirations, people like me and older people look at that and think, actually, this is surprisingly mundane. You know, people want a house to live in, they want a family, they want enough income to sort of have a car in the garage, maybe if they're still allowed one. But it's quite a small aspirations really that a lot of people are after. And unsurprisingly, because politics it's not just not materializing, but politics isn't even promising that to young people anymore. They're not even saying to them, this is what we want to provide for you. And so therefore, there is this sort of huge potential political market, if you will, that parties could tap into. Because nobody is doing it, the right's picking it all up. And it's interesting that in Germany, the AfD, the Alternative für Deutschland, literally means the alternative, as in the alternative to the Uniparty that was deliberately named that basically when they were set up, is actually in its origin a very libertarian kind of laissez-faire capitalism type party that was set up almost akin to UKIP basically as a sort of Eurosceptic party of intellectuals, of professors who started off in 2013 with it as a sort of thing that is very much akin to, I would say, sort of conservatism in this country, which is actually not a very German thing to promote in the first place, which is why they weren't doing very well. So they were already basically declared dead in their first sort of 5 years or so. Nobody thought this was going anywhere other than sort of being a lobby group. And then 2015 happened when Angela Merkel decided to basically allow over 1 million people into the country, and that decision has not yet been sort of reversed or even declared temporary, and that gave the AfD sort of its headwind. And the issue with that is that so far, basically none of the other parties have laid claim to that political field. And it's interesting that when both the sort of conservatives in Germany, the Christian conservatives in Germany, and the SPD, the Social Democrats, go out and campaign, they say to kind of the ordinary people of whom I've just been talking about, that yes, we acknowledge that you want all of these things, but basically the AfD doesn't deliver this for you. They are really quite a sort of aggressive, economically liberal party, and then they quote things like, you know, they voted against minimum wage at people. And the thing is that people don't care about that because the kind of fundamental things that they want, and immigration is a huge issue there, but basically conserving a society that they've known as younger people, that is something that the AfD is promising, and it is basically the only party that is doing that. And so people place that above everything else in the political detail in the AfD manifesto, which nobody sort of reads in any case. And they need basically one or both of the mainstream parties to tell them that the things that they were once promised by both of them will still be on the manifesto. It's really interesting when you look, especially at the Christian Democratic Union. That was the main political party, still is to some extent, but was the main political party for all the decades after the war. And in the 1980s, they still had things in their manifesto that would now be declared kind of far-right policies. You know, stuff in there like Germany is not an immigration country, for example, despite the fact that they were doing labor migration at the same time. But it's about fundamentally what society you want. Now you don't find that in the CDU manifesto anymore, and they're down to just over 30% when they used to have sort of over 40 for most of the time. Combined with the centre-left party, they had 90% of the electorate for most of the post-war era, and it's really declined in the last sort of 10 or so years in more recent history. So a kind of more conservative type of left-wing politics, or the other way around, more sort of left-wing conservatism should work. It should not just be the future, but it should be the present in the sense that it is the majority. And if you take democracy sort of literally in that it should reflect at the top what people at the bottom want, then it should already be the present. I think the reason why it isn't is because the political class just don't get it. I've been talking to people all throughout sort of the last year because I wrote Beyond the Wall, which was mentioned earlier, which was a history of East Germany. And because of the way that these problems are more severe in Eastern Germany today, where more people vote for far-right parties, I've been talking to politicians a lot over the last 2 years when they've suddenly decided that they need to reclaim the East and want someone to explain to them what was going on. And I kept saying it's a social issue. This isn't an East-West thing. This is working-class people, of whom there are more in the East, telling you that something isn't right. They vote in droves for the AfD, and here's why. And then, as Miriam was saying earlier, you kind of get branded as a right-wing extremist trying to explain to people why all of this stuff is happening, and it's just not getting there. There is one new party, and this is what I mean by a sort of ideological flexibility. There's one new party, the Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht, or Alliance Sarah Wagenknecht, named after the eponymous leader, which is trying to do these things. So it's sort of combining a more right-wing stance on things like immigration and a more left-wing stance on sort of social and cultural issues. The reason why that isn't really taking off, it is in the East where they're sort of getting about 15% or so. That's because Sarah Wagenknecht herself was born and raised in East Germany and is able to tap into some of those resentments that are still around, but what she's not able to tap into is that potential that I've just been talking about. And I think the reason is that even she puts her own sort of ideology and ideological package first rather than trying to understand what it is that people actually want. What I mean by that is her main motivation at the moment is the war in Ukraine and a form of what she calls pacifism, basically arguing against further weapon deliveries and support for Ukraine and putting that above everything else. So I think if you asked ordinary voters what her party stands for, the first thing that they'd come up with is sort of pacifism, sort of pro-Russian stance, not all of the other things that are actually in her manifesto. It's the same as with the AfD. You ask people what does the AfD stand for, they won't tell you it's an economic libertarian sort of thing, but they will tell you it's about immigration. And putting that one thing that is her personal strongest thing, first, when people care much, much more about, as I just said, two main issues, economy and immigration, means that the profile of the party doesn't fit in either. So it should be the present, and it should be the immediate and certainly foreseeable future. It isn't, because I think the political class haven't quite arrived at the same conclusion. Thank you.
We have to switch these on. Just speak into them, yeah? Okay. I mean, I thought that was a series of really terrific presentations. I thought David's phrase about the missing majority was very resonant, actually. Very interesting, Katja, that you were talking about language that the Christian Democrats used is now considered in some ways to be unacceptable, or as Miriam has been introduced as being far right. We see that in Sweden, for example, with the Social Democrats used to have a phrase, Folkheim, home for the people, which has been taken up by Jimmy Åkesson and the Sweden Democrats, who are seen as hard right or far right. But that was once a mainstream social democratic slogan, now appropriated by the so-called far right, although the Sweden Democrats do have a fascist origins, although they've begun to move. We've got so many interesting people in the room, so we should probably take some questions. I'll be leaving this table in about 35 minutes, which is an act of left conservatism, I now understand, from Dan Hitchens, which is terrific. There's so much to pick up on from Miriam's comments about family, Philip's defense of empire, which I thought was very interesting. I was going to ask you what happens if the emperor is a tyrant. But let's come to that in a moment. Dan Hitchens, I thought, brilliantly brought in Tawny, the delivery of vegetables, and the Labour's interesting that you call Starmer's government a kind of soft left conservative government. So why are they failing in some ways? Is it a catastrophic lack of communication, a failure to tell a national story? Is it also undermined by a kind of grim utilitarianism, a Gradgridian obsession with delivery and numbers? And I was really grateful, Katja, for your comments, internationalizing our conversation, looking at Germany and elsewhere. Michael Lind and I had a long conversation about some of these themes at Policy Exchange. Was it on Wednesday, Michael? It's been a long week, especially for you, sir. Let's take some questions. The gentleman at the very back, then we'll have Sohrab, and you in the third row. So we'll take 3 to start with, and then keep it moving. So you first, sir, then you, and then please you. Thank you very much.
Cheers. Luke Bretherton, just on his way to Oxford. So this, thank you for a really fantastic panel, really engaging. This is a kind of question purely out of ignorance, and I haven't been living in this country for over a decade. So just trying to get my head round some of the debates, and it's a very boring question, but I completely agree with what was said about the family, and I think that's such an important set of points. The bit that I'm struggling to join the dots over, and just wanted to take the opportunity, to hear from each of you on this, is the squaring of concern about family and questions of kind of, to put it horribly, social reproduction, with the kind of question of migration and how, if a declining birth rate and kind of pro-natalist policies and the concern about migration, and bracketing the question of numbers, but just purely on this question of how do you connect people's concern for a good family life who want to come with a broader concern about how families are being supported and a need for more people, to put it crudely.
Okay, thank you. We'll take Sohrab in the front row.
This was such a wonderful panel. Each of the contributions was just terrific. But I just wanted to put in a word of praise for Miriam, because in terms of big tech regulation and the distraction economy, because I once had a debate with another member of your party, Jacob Rees-Mogg, and my comrade on my side there was one Ash Sarkar, but we were on the kind of post-liberal side, and I said, like parents who have to work 2-3 jobs, they're going to have to, they end up using screens as babysitters, and the algorithms are designed by neurologists to be as addictive as possible. Mm-hmm. And I believe it was Jacob, his other partner was George Will, but I think it was Jacob who said, last time I checked, there was something called parenting. Yeah. And the crowd roared. As it happens, Ash and I won, but it's such a breath of fresh air to hear someone who's a Tory, speak up for parents and families, and the bargaining power, and just the power disparity between us and big tech companies with neurologists on staff to make their apps addictive. So thank you for that. But I wanted to ask, so that was just a comment, but very quickly, what we think of possibly the formulation left but not progressive as a sort of, because the left side of this is often comes up short, and I've been heartened by certain things that the new incoming Trump administration has done. However, for the most part, I find that a lot of the conservatives who are willing to toy with left conservatism, it's pretty shallow. And, just one last example. Someone from the Spain's Vox party emailed me and said, we'd love to have you come to Madrid to talk about the virtues of free markets. I was like, well, yeah, you haven't really been following my work. Anyway, but I'll just stop there. How do we bolster the actual left portion of that?
Okay, I remember that slogan, left but not progressive. You were urging that upon me, not quite recently, for a slogan for the New Statesman. The lady there in the fourth row, please.
Coretta from Plough. Thank you for all your contributions, and I especially love the quote from Tani. He's an author I appreciate a lot. My question is, how do we reach the people who would love to live up to the ideal, but for various reasons, often pretty much beyond their control, they find it out of reach? whether it's not being rooted in a family and community because they come from a broken home, whether it's not being able to find a spouse and therefore not being able to have kids. Yeah. It's the generation, I mean, I'm a millennial, so just the guilting of why aren't you getting ahead economically over the years. If you are born in a country where there's wars and you would love to live a good life and you can't, and so you feel your only choice is to immigrate instead of being able to live a peaceful life in your home culture and network, you know. So how do you reach people like that? Because my fear is that to taking the ideal for granted and normal can be off-putting, if especially for the people who really, really want to get there and feel they can't, and there may be a reaction.
Okay, that's very well put. Thank you for that. So we've got family, we've got big tech regulation, left but not progressive, and trying to live up to ideals, but the economic and social circumstances in which you're operating make living up to those ideals so difficult. Who wants to go first on the family? Miriam first?
Yes.
Or David? David first. Okay. David on the family.
Okay. Well, so it's on the family and immigration point, which is a good point, and I think there is this sort of historic assumption that as countries get richer, natives move up the kind of career chain, as it were. Perhaps particularly women. There are many more women now who are training as medical consultants, so there are far fewer women working as nurses or kind of social carers, and you bring in immigrants to do those often low status, low paid care jobs. That is what is happening, and I don't think it should be happening. If you leave the immigration tap on, you don't adjust your own society. You see that in the private sector. If you leave the immigration tap on, then employers will not train people. If you leave the immigration tap on in the social care field, you will not raise the status and pay of those jobs. People like working in social care. It comes very high up the job satisfaction rankings. They cannot afford to because the pay is so poor in many instances. It would cost about £1 billion, £1.5 billion a year to have a minimum, a sort of special social care minimum wage that was £1 or £1.50 above the already quite high minimum wage, and we would not need to import people from Zimbabwe and the Philippines. We already have. Yeah, well, I'll stop there.
Okay, David, thank you. Miriam, on the big tech regulation.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really big fissure at the heart of people who call themselves conservatives. And I think the way I try to explain it to people like Jacob and others is that we as conservatives historically accept the need for state regulation when the ordinary individual and family cannot stand up to a threat without help from the state. Now, the obvious one for that is the fact that we have a military. You know, if Russia invades, we are not all on our own. Hopefully, the government has built an army from our taxes. And we also accept that for, you know, when new industries and technologies come along. So the obvious recent example is the invention of the motor car. You can't just say, if there was no road regulation at all, and there was no speed limits, there were no consequences for bad driving, no rules of the road, you could not say to an ordinary parent, teach your child to cross the road safely. It would be impossible. You first of all need the regulation, then the parent can do their job. And I think we're exactly the same position with big tech. First of all, we need the regulation, and to accept that this is not a technology suitable for children or whatever we decide, then parents can do their job. And I think that's where we need to get the right-wing conservatives to. And then also, I'm very concerned about the impact of people like Elon Musk. And just because he's on our side on certain issues does not mean that it's okay for the richest man in the world to influence our politics and democracy. And we, you know, if we wouldn't like that if somebody on the left did that, we should be very, very concerned about someone on the right doing it.
So Elon Musk is the key to getting applause as well. Remember that next time you're on Any Questions. Philip wants to come in on the left but not progressive, and I'd like Dan perhaps to answer the lady in the fourth row who spoke about ideals being out of reach, and then I'll bring Katja in on international context in the next round.
So Sohrab, sorry. on the right, we had this discussion years ago. I remember it with David, and David was saying, Philip, we can't call it post-liberal. You know, it's too cosmopolitan a term. And post-liberal has been what remained. I coined the term red Tory, kind of take it from the Canadian tradition. In a sense, that took off, but people thought it was liberal. And I think the same fate awaits left, but not progressive. Because, look, the Conservative Party remained predominantly a liberal party in the United Kingdom, much to my chagrin, much to the distress of many. It remains resolutely liberal. Its parliamentary party is overwhelmingly liberal. Its membership, after kind of the Brexit failure, and it was an utter failure, I'm afraid, the members left and it's remained more liberal. And it will fail because it's liberal. The Labour Party is overwhelmingly liberal. 2/3 of Labour MPs voted for kind of state-assisted suicide. So we are faced with absolute power of liberals in our party. Nowhere does the majority that is socially conservative and wants, let's use a different phrase than left, economic emancipation and needs economic redress. Nowhere is that represented. I remember I was on Nigel Farage's show and we were chatting and we went off air. And I said, Nigel, you'd really make it into government if you stopped being a libertarian, because your libertarian economics isn't what your voters want. And he's a clever man. He goes, yeah, Philip, I know. What we need is nationalist economics. But he doesn't believe in that. It's your problem in Germany. But people see them as anti-immigration. So nowhere, not even on the populist side, do we get sort of a kind of an offer. So just one more conclusion. I think it's important. So in biological life, hybrids survive. People who are not, entities that are not hybrid don't work. Understanding Trump is very difficult because on the one hand, he believes in tariffs and Biden continued that and it worked for the repatriation, the Anti-Inflation Act, the CHIPS Act, all of that. But then he maintains an extreme plutocratic free market system. It's a hybrid. It's the same with UKIP. What we have to do, because we're all kind of intellectuals, so we believe in coherence, but coherence doesn't cut through. What cuts through is this odd, peculiar mixture of kind of social nationalism and domestic libertarianism. I mean, it's a mess, but people love it. And they identify with it as long as you're anti-migrant, in some senses, in very unpleasant ways. So until we address that, we're not going to progress this. And unfortunately, I think, if Nigel wants power, he's got to drop that, and I think he will eclipse the Conservative Party if he does. One final thing on family. All the evidence shows that massive state support for the family doesn't really shift the birth rate. It's tiny, from Norway to Hungary. But you know what does shift the birth rate? Ideation. If you can teach children love is a possibility, if you can teach children that romance and love make a difference, that's the only thing that makes a difference. And if you look at mating behaviour, people and surveys of young people, they don't believe meeting the right person is an option for them. And that kind of cultural ideation around marriage at an early age is really the missing element in pro-family natalist policy offer.
Okay, Dan, over to you on the latest question.
Greta, it's a really good question. And I'll say one really nice, ironic thing, and then one really awful, provocative thing. So the nice, ironic thing is, I think you can start from what affections and aspirations people have. You know, most people do want to have more kids than they're able to have, or than they think they're able to have. Most people, you know, polling shows do not want both parents working full time. They want one parent to be able to help raise the kids. So if you begin with what's in people's hearts, I think a politics like that can go a long way without necessarily elevating some new standard that's going to make people feel bad. Okay, that was the nice bit. The provocative bit is, this is the appeal of liberalism. No one is going to judge your choice, right up to the point where it really visibly and provably affects the person sitting next to you. Basically, that's the ideal, is that you won't be judged. Whether that happens in reality or not is another question. But obviously we're here talking about post-liberalism because enough people feel that liberalism actually fails to deliver what it promises. And my thought about yesterday was what emerged from the critiques of liberalism was the power of organization, the organization of liberal capitalism, the organization of liberal institutions in academia and the media and the kind of anywhere infrastructure, the organization of the liberal state which defends this order. It's phenomenal. And then liberalism also has a story, this wonderful story of breaking free from the attachments that hold us back so that we can make our own way in the world, by ourselves, fulfill our own aspirations. A phenomenal organization, a phenomenal story. In other words, it's a religion. And maybe it takes one religion to beat another religion.
Okay. A ripple of applause without mentioning Elon Musk. Okay, I'm going to take another batch of questions. Let's have a look. You've been very patient, so I'll take you. Gentleman at the back with your right hand raised with a grey beard, if you don't mind me mentioning that. Gentleman with the spectacles there. Remember Robin Day always used to say, the gentleman with the spectacles. It's you, sir, yes. Should we take a fourth question? You've been very patient as well, sir. And then you next time. So 4 more questions. I can't remember who's first. You.
Thank you so much. This is so important. And so I'm Eirik from the University of Bergen in Norway, but I'm also representing a left-wing journal called Realist in the west of Bergen in Norway. And I don't know, there might be some Danes or other Scandinavians here. I know that there's one Finnish lady here, I think. But apart from that I'm quite alone. And that's the case. Well, no, but the point is, the problem is that there is no kind of how to break into a kind of post-liberal paradigm in Scandinavia and especially in Norway. I think you have the same problem. This is addressed to Katja's brilliant presentation. Is this a time of creating new parties, or should we try to, with the universities, should we try to reform the existing parties? For example, because I think we have in Norway the same problem as in Germany. The only party addressing immigration, for example, is essentially the most right-wing one. And so we're in a kind of dead end. There we are.
That's an excellent question. Thank you very much. And you're among friends today. Yusuf, please.
Thank you. You're very kind. I've been told my beard is white, actually, but that's okay.
What did I call it? Great, I apologise.
Yeah, that's okay. That's great.
I want
to just raise the issue of migration. And throughout these few days, migration has been seen as something that happens basically here in Britain and Europe. You'll get my accent. I'm not quite British. So my question is this: suppose we decided, yes, in terms of the health or the work, the caring professions, we need to keep it British, we need to keep it Irish, whatever. Something is going to happen in those other countries. Something has already happened in those other countries. There's a relationship between here and there, which is causing migration in the first place. That's a major cause. We're already bound up with one another. We can't just unlock or unhitch. We can't just say, yeah, we want to be sovereign. There are other people on the planet, and we're affecting them. And what are we going to do about that?
Absolutely. Third question, Yusuf, and then the fourth question in the front row. This one down here, please. Morris, you're leaving us.
He's just wandering disconsolately at the back.
Morris, I agree this is a period of regeneration. Don't go. Don't go. It is, I apologise. We got there, we're there.
Thank you very much. I find the title of the panel very interesting, Left Conservatism, but now I'm a bit disappointed because I heard a lot about conservative lamento or critiques, family, pornography, birth rates and so on, but not so much about left economic policies. So what kind of left economic policies do you actually support, and what's left about them?
It's a very, very good question. And the fourth question here, please.
Thank you. I had a question for Katja Hoyer about the mismatch between voter sentiment and politicians. And I'm just wondering, I mean, in the United States, that ended up shifting. The election of Trump is a sort of demonstration that the voter sentiment really had a substantial effect on the politics, on the politicians. And it seems as if in Germany, you have the AfD, who is kind of representing that voter sentiment, but there's a liberal consensus that is kind of trying to suppress that. And I'm just wondering what you think it would take to kind of break that logjam.
Okay, thank you. Katja, why don't you come back on that question immediately? And then there's also the first question from our friend from Norway about the need for new parties, perhaps. But over to you.
Yes, so I've been asking myself the same question, because you could see the AfD growing. It's now about a fifth of the population in the polls that want to vote for them. Whether that will actually translate into votes, I mean, remains to be seen. I think that depends a bit what the other parties do. It also links into the question as to whether we need new parties or whether the existing parties can kind of tap into that sentiment. My instinct would be that it's more likely if the two main parties, so the centre-left and the centre-right, similar to what we have seen in, say, Denmark or in Sweden to some extent, kind of go into a more left-wing conservative direction, because that's where they came from in Germany. People often translate the CDU, the Christian Democratic Party, into conservatives, but they're really not like the British Conservatives. They're very happy with, or were traditionally very happy with, state intervention, with kind of very sort of working class orientated politics that were looking at technical skills, valuing manual labor, that sort of thing. That's really the tradition that they came out of, and very Christian traditions as well. After the Second World War. So I think if they were to return to something more akin to what they were, they would get a lot of the voters back who are deeply disaffected. I think as what Philip's just been saying about Nigel Farage as well is true. Also in Germany, if you combine kind of right-wing with kind of economic libertarianism, that doesn't really work for the majority of voters. It works for those who are so keen on the immigration question that they ignore everything else. But you're never going to get beyond a certain threshold with what people really want is a sort of social stability, I think, in their lives, knowing that they're going to be valued members of society and that there's politics that facilitates that for them, rather than a sort of elbowy society where everyone's on their own. So my answer to both of these things would be that I think we have seen an example of that in Denmark, I think, where a traditional sort of centre-left party has gone back to very right-wing politics in lots of ways. And I think that's sort of where a lot of the people within the Social Democratic Party are actually, they're looking at that. It's just the problem of, can't remember if it was David earlier mentioning the sort of change within the political parties that they're now effectively, I think it was Phillip actually, where basically you now have parties of graduates trying to understand what the majority of the population who aren't, university educated. Certainly in Germany, there's still a lot of emphasis on apprenticeships and things like that. That's the big mismatch. So if they can bring themselves to listen to the smaller contingent in their own parties who realize these sorts of things, then I think that's the answer to both of those questions, rather than trying new parties, because they tend to be very single issue focused, and that's not really what people want.
That's excellent. Thank you very much. The question you raised is a very good one about an economic programme. Obviously, at the New Statesman, we're particularly interested in a left economic programme and have been exploring that. So look, I think at least three of us on the panel want to answer you, because we don't want to leave you with a sense of disappointment. That would be really disappointing to me. So let's go. David, Dan also wants to speak on this, and then you do too, don't you? So start.
I was actually going to do the immigration.
All right, you go that. Dan, you go first and on economics, and then Philip to follow that.
Okay.
And David on immigration. Right.
Non-economist warning, but the critique from the left, which is very much in the Tory tradition I mentioned, that really resonates with me and makes a lot of sense to me. It's about power imbalance. Obviously, if you're paying a huge amount of money to your landlord every month, while they're, even the most assiduous landlord, not doing that much, they have extraordinary power over you, you're kind of disempowered in your everyday life because you might be in an economically precarious situation. And that is an injustice. What if actually a lot of the British economy is on that model? This is more or less, as I understand him, what Brett Christophers, the economic geographer, argues in his idea of rentier capitalism as the British model. If you own an asset, you have tremendous power. I mean, I'm sure Philip's written a lot about this question of asset ownership. And Christophers goes through all these sectors of the economy and says, who has the power in the British economy? Not just the wealth, but the power. People who own financial assets, outsourcing contracts, natural resources, platforms like Deliveroo or Amazon Marketplace or whatever, land, IP, infrastructure. If you own those assets, then you can just keep charging higher fees for them. You don't need to innovate. You can cut costs by paying your workers less and treating them more. If that's true, and I've not seen a really compelling critique of it, though I'd be interested to read one, then I think in the British context, that is the challenge to unwind that huge power imbalance. And I think it has conservative implications, which maybe Philip can spell out. Thank you.
Yeah. I'm not wholly persuaded by left-wing economics, if I'm honest. If it just culminates in what we have, which is welfareism for the many and ownership for the few, I'm really not in favour of it at all. I'm not particularly in favour of high levels of taxation. Big businesses can avoid it, and it just becomes a permanent penalty on small businesses, who, in my view, are the only decent businesses out there that can operate. So other than the kind of lucid left-wing critique that we don't invest enough and we don't train enough, I don't have any particular left-wing policies that jump out at me as, oh, I'd choose that. So what I will say is what we most lack in post-liberalism is a political economy. But there are some elements we can name. And I think distributism is absolutely key. And distributism, coming from Belloc, Belloc's essay on property is just magnificent, and Chesterton. It's imperative that we recapitalise the poor, which was a phrase I used way back when. The recapitalisation of people in the bottom deciles is absolutely vital to any subsequent equitable society. It's interesting, if you look at Norway, if you look at Scandinavia, why have they had the tradition of equity they had? If you trace it back, they were the countries that most successfully overthrew and escaped from feudalism. We had a half escape. Russia didn't escape at all. So if we can recover effective form of distributism, pace Margaret Thatcher's council house sales, which worked, but weren't renewed, what didn't work was mass share ownership. People just sold it and bought Betamax recorders or something. The other element that I've long argued for is competition policy. We've had a pro-monopoly, plutocracy competition policy for generations, which has positively encouraged the setting up of monopolies and the creation of the rentier system. I think there are two elements of a post-liberal economics. And I think unless and until we can build upon that and get the right balance, we're never going to eliminate the market. But until we induce something like, I mean, John talked about this, until we can induce a higher value than money to regulate the market. The Romans had it. Most societies have had it. The tradition of Christian democracy built upon the notion that something should govern the market. Unless we can recover something like that regulates exchange and status and accords honour that gives you status and rewards you, we're not going to really pull this off, is my view on that front.
Thank you, Philip. David, on immigration.
Yeah. Well, actually, just very briefly on economics. The obvious policy, I think, for left conservatism is a land tax. It's kind of lying there to be used. But I also think, we desperately need a kind of left Thatcherism. I mean, we all know that we're drowning in the kind of regulatory bureaucratic state. We can't do anything. We need to clean out the plumbing as well as having a decent social market economy. But on the immigration question, what you said sort of reminded me of the famous quote from, I can't remember who it was again, about the German Gastarbeiter. We invited workers and we got people, and people who were very pro mass immigration often sort of say, look beyond the numbers at the individuals, but also look beyond the individuals at the numbers. I mean, you cannot have 1 million people or more than 1 million people a year coming into a country like the UK. There is such a thing as society. Society is not just a random collection of individuals. It's quite hard to join a new society, and it's quite hard for the society that you come to kind of absorb you. Yes, of course, we have a relationship, say, with the Philippines. The Philippines has a whole political economy based on exporting people, but it's an extremely cruel one. Children are separated from their mothers for decades, and fortunately, this system is coming to an end because those countries are also running out of people. And it's also, in many cases, the most appalling brain drain from these countries. Jobs that we can perfectly well do ourselves, we just need to raise the pay and status of them, rather than taking, it's morally unacceptable, and we're an international outlier in the proportion of doctors and nurses we have who have been trained abroad, mainly from much poorer countries. There are said to be more Ghanaian health professionals working here than in frigging Ghana. This is not something we should be proud of.
Okay. Miriam, do you want to come in? You sure? I'm going to seamlessly pass on the chairing role to my former editor, David Goodhart. So I'm going. Thank you very much, everyone.
Okay. We got time for a final round or two. There is someone I recognise. Well, let's go to you, Michael, and then the guy in front of you.
I want to briefly try to answer the challenge about what a left conservative economic programme would look like. And very briefly, and then people can react and say it's rubbish. The first thing is that the panel have identified many of the key parts. Firstly, you need to change competition policy. So at the moment, the Chicago school reigns. It's barriers to entry that count. It should be the size, the monopoly or the oligopoly within our market that should be challenged. Competition policy needs to change. The second is that we need to have a form of land value taxation. Particularly, we should start with taxing the unearned increment that landowners secure whenever planning permission is given. This is genuinely money for nothing on their part. I'm just carrying on. We also need an industrial strategy with a reindustrialization of our economy, particularly in areas of existing strength, including, I'm afraid, that means our arms industry. But in order to have an effective reindustrialization, we need to get rid of our insane current energy policy, which is leading to deindustrialization. We need to have an assault on absentee landlordism, and that means, in particular, looking at foreign ownership of property, particularly in the capital, which needs to be restricted. We need to have a contributory welfare system which is more generous to those whose families have built up the social capital of our country. And we also need to change the way in which private equity operates by having a more effective system of taxation to deal with the way in which they extract value from the productive part of the economy. So that's just a start. Why didn't we do it? Well, sadly, I didn't win the Conservative leadership on the 2 occasions I tried.
Very, very good, very good. I have just been told by the Pope that we have only time for one more question. So the guy in front of Michael.
Yes, again, fantastic panel. I have one big question aimed in 2 directions. The first is for Miriam. In light of your endorsement of a very active and involved state in areas where many traditional conservatives, especially in the United States, would hate government involvement, for example, in how they run their families and raise their kids, what are safeguards that you would deem necessary to prevent government overreach, even by a left conservative government? And then also for Phillip, in similar question, in keeping with the recognizing the universal in others, and something that I agree with. But as you said, that becomes inherently imperialist. And since it is an inherently imperial and universal impulse, how do we safeguard against that becoming merely a project of foisting our particulars on others? I spent about 14 months in the Middle East, and something that my American compatriots talked about a lot is, why do we have to, in some ways, adopt their culture in order to get along with people in that region of the world? While we're there, why can't they just embrace, Western values? And how do we navigate endorsing the universal, but also not crossing that barrier into just saying, hey, adopt our particulars? And also a small question for you, Philip. Very interested in your unwritten book on aesthetic and how things tell us how we should see them. Could you give us a blurb on that? Because there has been some commentary.
A very brief one. So Miriam, then Phillip, and unless you've, respond to anything Michael said and the last question.
So just to clarify, I'm certainly not in favour of an over-interventionist state or an overactive state, and I think in many areas of our lives the state is far too active and in control. In the minutiae of detail, in over-regulation, there's a huge amount that I think the state should come out of. But nevertheless, some of the biggest problems that we face do need state intervention because they are new problems, and whenever any new technology or new change occurs, there has to be a response. So I would use the example of the first industrial revolution when children were sent down mines, and there was a terrible industrial disaster actually in my former constituency, and loads of children died. And the country hadn't realised that children as young as 7 and 8 were being sent down mines. And the political class was appalled. And within 2 years, children were banned from working down mines. Now, of course, the owners of the mines objected to that. The parents of the children objected to that because the children were bringing in income. But that was the state being interventionist and responding to a new threat as a result of the new technology. And that's where I think we are with the technology of the internet, essentially, and the change in the fertility rate. And I agree with Philip that state intervention in terms of welfare is not enough to change the birth rate, but I do think it's necessary, even if not sufficient. And then following on from left-wing economic policies, what I would say is that we have socialised the cost of old age. You will get a pension, and you will get healthcare, and you will get looked after, whether or not you've paid enough into the system, and whether or not you yourself have had children, and therefore continuing to contribute to the economy even after you die. We've socialised that. Now, I can't see any political drive for reversing that. But we've also privatised the cost of having children. It's now completely on you as a nuclear family to bring those children into the world. That wasn't the normal state of affairs. So we've broken the economic incentive to have children, and there used to be one. Because if you wanted to be looked after and cared for in old age, if you wanted your family business to continue to bring in income, you had to have children. We have severed that link, and I think the only acceptable response to that is to socialise the cost of having children in the way that we've socialised the cost of old age. So if that's a left-wing policy, we'll have it.
Very good. Final word to the Red Tory.
Yeah, brief blurb for the unwritten book on aesthetics. So the really interesting thing about aesthetics is, well, lots of authors have concluded with aesthetics, I think particularly of Adorno, with a kind of pathos around it. But I think that the great question is how do you introduce the objective or the universal into a culture that was foreign to it? And I'm a realist. I think everything is real. Angels, stones, rocks, arrangements. The thing about this realism is it's about relationships. And since all objects are related to other objects, and I'm somewhat persuaded by pancyclism in the sense that nobody can make sense of matter without mind, but everyone can make sense of mind with matter. So I think every object has the ability to call for mind to read it properly. And I think painting is an account of how objects align themselves so you can read the world properly. So that's that. Second point about empire, which is about 70% written, and I've just got the book contract for the empire book. The conflict between universals is unavoidable. And it has, I think, and it depends which universal you're in conflict with. So there are very bad, rapacious, awful empires that are particulars that are universalized. Race would be one. The German experience of empire from the 1930s onwards was a particularly awful example. But that was the universalizing of a particular, not the universalizing of a universal. And what I favour is that if you universalize the transcendent, that can contain particulars within it. You can't elide that universal will arrange those particulars in a different way. And empires, by the way, are the vehicle for transcending racism. They're the organisation that said that, they're the social organisation that said race is not the primary category. Empires often proceed by war but stop war on an almost universal scale. That's why you have had from Pax Britannica to the Pax Romana. And so the final point is that the right universal allows a subsidiarity of particulars under it and doesn't require you to erase that particular practice. But it does require that you uphold the universal. In our country, we no longer uphold the universal, so we do have a war of all against all. And that's a war of particulars against particulars, and only universals can save us. Thank you.
The particular of lunch is now upon us, so let's have a final round of applause.